Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the memory edition of 5-Minute Psych. In this 5-minute segment, we'll explore why we forget, starting with the course of forgetting, or how the amount of content we forget changes over time. Then we'll focus on 5 reasons that can explain why we forget. In the early 1900s, a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus studied his own memory for lists of nonsense syllables like fap and koss. He didn't want any interference from prior learning, so he came up with lists of hundreds of meaningless syllables, learned them, and then tested his memory for these lists at different retention intervals. He found that most forgetting occurred shortly after he learned a list, but whatever content stayed with him after that, it was likely to stay with him long term. Today we call this pattern of forgetting the forgetting curve, and it's been replicated many times using many different kinds of lists. Now that we know that most forgetting occurs shortly after learning, we can consider 5 different reasons why we forget. One explanation is decay of the memory trace, or the idea that whatever physical trace is laid down in our nervous system when we learn something, that physical trace fades away over time if we don't use it. Now, although we're starting to understand the changes in brain circuitry as we learn, unfortunately, we're not at the point where we find physical changes in the brain that echo the pattern that we see behaviorally with the forgetting curve. And that's the kind of support we'd want to see. But it's still a possible reason for forgetting: decay of the physical memory trace. Another reason is brain damage, and this can result in the most dramatic cases of forgetting with amnesia. In fact, there are 2 types of amnesia, and the difference is easiest to explain if you look at this lifeline bar. Notice there's a brain injury that happens right here in the middle, and we can ask what a person with an injury here can remember from their lifespan. Now, with retrograde amnesia, the person can't remember anything from before their injury, but they can learn new things after their injury. For example, a skier may bump their head and then not remember what happened right before the accident, but they can still learn new things after the accident. With anterograde amnesia, now the person can remember everything from before their injury, but they're unable to learn any new explicit memories. You could tell them the same joke over and over again, and they'd laugh just as heartily as they did the first time, not remembering that they just heard it a few minutes ago. But curiously, these patients can learn new skills, which would require implicit memory, just as well as someone without anterograde amnesia. Encoding and retrieval failure are also reasons for forgetting. With encoding failure, the content never got into memory in the first place, so maybe it isn't fair to think of this as true forgetting. With retrieval failure, this is different because now the content is in memory, but you can't access it to get it out again. Likely, this happens because you don't have the right retrieval cue, or the links to the memory are decayed even if the memory itself is intact. Sometimes we might even experience a tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon, feeling like the thing we're trying to remember is right there out of reach, and we may even be able to remember the first letter of it, and that can help to serve as a retrieval cue. But a good way to prevent retrieval failure is to have multiple retrieval cues at the time of encoding, or make sure you have different ways of accessing the memory. Sometimes we forget because other information comes in and interferes with our ability to remember, and many psychologists today view this as a major cause of forgetting. There are 2 types of interference: proactive and retroactive. With proactive interference, content that you learned before interferes with your ability to remember newer material. For example, you keep typing your old password even though you remember your new password. With retroactive interference, now new content interferes with your ability to remember older material. For instance, your ability to remember your geography lesson will be impaired if you have to study history right after, compared to if you didn't. This means that anything that happens before or after you learn something can affect your memory of that content. Well, we just looked at why we forget by starting with the forgetting curve and a look at how the amount of content that we forget changes over time. Then we focused on 5 reasons that can explain why we forget. Now, aren't you glad you had 5 minutes?